Today I found in Mametz Wood a certain cure for lust of blood. Hi, I'm Paul Reed, a military historian and writer, and I've spent most of my life walking the battlefields of the Great War. Welcome to the old front line. In this regular podcast, we'll travel together across the haunting battlefields from Ypres to the Somme and beyond. And this week, we're amongst the birds and under the trees, the canopy of Mametz Wood on the Somme. That quote we began with comes from Robert Graves, the author, poet and veteran of the Great War, one of many writers to bring alive the story of Mametz Wood, a fiercely fought-over corner of the Somme battlefields. And it's there we'll be walking in this week's podcast. We'll come back to Graves and the wood later, but we'll begin our journey outside a cemetery close to the village of Mametz, Dantzig Alley. Dantzig Alley Cemetery was named after a German trench that ran between the village of Mametz, to our left, across towards the next village, Montauban, at the other end of the road that we're standing on. It was part of the German second line of defence here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and British troops reached and captured this position on that day. It then became effectively our front line in this area until the Battle of the Somme continued, and the attacks took British troops down these slopes towards the woods, the horseshoe of woods, including Mametz, which we can just see in the distance in the valley below us. As we go through the cemetery gates and up the steps, the original plot is on the right. It was made later in the battle, when this was behind the British front line and part of the evacuation route for wounded. So there was medical facilities here, and some of the men brought in here died of their wounds and were buried on this spot. But amongst the original plot are men killed on the battlefield in the front line going into action, and their battalions brought them back here for burial away from where the fighting was. After the war, the cemetery was greatly enlarged, and there's just under 2,000 graves here now, making it one of the largest cemeteries in this area. As we go up through the shelter and down the steps and turn right into this first plot of graves, we see two things very quickly. We see a substantial number of unknown soldiers, either partly identified or not identified at all, and we see a lot of graves with the coat of arms of the city of Manchester, and these are men from the Manchester Regiment, in fact largely from the Manchester POWs battalions, recruited at the very beginning of the war, and who went into their baptism of fire at Mametz, coming down the slopes and into the village, taking it from the Germans on that first day of the Battle of the Somme. Whenever I stand amongst these graves, I think of the stories of those Manchester men, but I also think of my old friend John Dray, and I know I talk about him a lot in this podcast. He was someone that I visited the battlefields with on a regular basis over the years. He worked with me in the early years of Ledger Battlefields as a guide, and he had incredible knowledge and was free to impart that knowledge, and I learned a lot from him. In the 1960s, he travelled with the British Legion to attend the 50th anniversary of the Great War commemorations from 64 through to 68. And on the 1st of July 1966, he was here at Dantzig Alley and in a little estaminet, a little cafe in the village of nearby Mametz. On his tour bus was a group of veterans from the Manchester POWs, men from the same battalion, but not just the same battalion, the same platoon, including their platoon commander, an officer. The old platoon sergeant was there too, and there he was, John said, at the bar, lining them up, just as he'd done on a parade ground, but instead of getting their rations, they were queuing for a beer. John was sat with the officer at a table, and the officer was quietly, calmly and proudly overseeing his old platoon of 50 years before. He turned to John and he said, "See that man at the bar, Dre? He's my old platoon sergeant. A damn fine man in a tight corner." John loved to tell that tale. He thought it was one of the greatest epitaphs any soldier could have. Today the veterans have all gone, but as we walk amongst these rows, we see those men from Manchester and the outlying towns and villages around the city. We see Captain May, who wrote an incredible series of letters now published, and Lieutenant Colonel Lewis, one of the commanders of the 20th Manchesters. But he doesn't have the Manchester cap badge on his grave. He was an officer of the Indian Army, the 37th Lancers, who'd been on attachment to the Manchesters and was one of a number of Indian Army officers who was posted to POWs battalions on the eve of the Battle of the Somme. The army was worried that many of the original commanders were not fit for purpose, were not up to leading their men into a big attack, and replaced them with regulars or Indian Army men like Lewis, a man who had spent his life leading by example. He was killed taking his men into battle, into the attack on that terrible 1st of July. Walking along the rows of graves, we take a path through 2 wide trees that flank the cross of sacrifice, and behind it, on the cemetery wall, is a memorial seat to the men of the 14th Battalion of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, one of the units of the 38th Welsh Division, who figure heavily in our walk. There's also a little plaque near the shelter to the veterans of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. When I think back to the 1980s and remember a time when I bumped into my old friend Trevor Tasker, who had a red minibus and within it a group of Great War veterans from Wales, Hugh Parry Morris and Tom Price amongst them, and I was lucky to be able to clamber into the back of that van with them and spend some days going round the battlefields in their company and going down to Mametz Wood. And we'll return to what Tom Price's dream was when we visited that area later on in this walk. For now, we'll hop over the wall, walk along the edge of the field boundary to where it meets a track that runs along the edge of Dantzig Alley Cemetery, and here we'll turn right away from the cemetery and follow that track downhill. There's spectacular views from this point, not just of Mametz Wood, which lies to our right beneath us in the valley, but beyond to the high ground of the Pozieres Ridge. You can see the masthead on the site of the Pozieres windmill, and in the distance to the left, the walls of the Pozieres British Cemetery and Memorial. On a good day, you might even spot the top of the Thiepval Memorial in the distance. Away to our left is Mametz, beyond that Fricourt, and to our right, Montauban, and beyond that the continuation of the Horseshoe of Woods, with the village of Longueval, and beyond that Delville Wood, High Wood, and the woods around Bazentin, as well as Bernafay and Trones Wood. Many people come to the Somme thinking that it's flat, and as you walk down tracks like this and look across this landscape, you'll see that it's far from flat. And wherever you have an observation point like this, a great vista across the battlefields, you can bet that at some point it was in occupation by the German army, who set their stall, laid out their positions here well at the beginning of the war in 1914. We continue along the track to where it meets an embankment. There was a gully here in 1916 which was marked on the trench maps as Queen's Nullah. A nullah was an old word from the frontier of India, meaning a dried riverbed. And this wasn't quite one of those, but it was the name given to this position. On the evening of the 22nd of July 1916, somehow a staff car found its way through the village of Mametz, down some of these tracks, and pulled up at the base of this bank. Clambering out of the staff car was the commanding officer of the 34th Division, Major General Edward Charles Ignaville Williams, known as Inky Bill to his men. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, he'd watched the destruction of his division, and despite their terrible losses, more than 6,000 casualties in the attack on La Boisselle and the surrounding ground, they were still on the Somme front, still holding the line and taking over this sector around Contalmaison and Mametz Wood in preparation for more attacks as the battle moved forward. He'd come for a personal reconnaissance. We tend to think of men like him. He commanded 20,000 men on paper as being in chateaux behind the lines with their feet up on characters like Baldric, supping champagne and eating foie gras. The reality was these men had led by example, just like Colonel Lewis, who we mentioned before, all their lives, and they were not going to skulk back in some chateau. They wanted to see what was happening, and Inky Bill had come up for this personal reconnaissance. He clambered up the bank and stood there with his binoculars surveying the ground, but unbeknown, he was a target. He was visible from the German positions, and immediately came under shell fire. And at around about 7 o'clock, a shell exploded and Inky Bill was killed. He became one of the most senior British officer casualties on the Somme in 1916, destroying that myth, I hope, of chateau generals. Ignaville Williams was not buried here. He was taken back for burial, and his grave today can be found in Waloy-Ballon Communal Cemetery Extension, behind the lines on the Somme front. From here we'll continue along the track that runs beneath this embankment to where it meets a minor road, and here turn right, and follow that road up over the high ground, beyond the Queen's Nullah, to a point where it descends down through some trees into the valley beneath Mametz Wood. As we turn the corner here, we see ahead of us the Red Dragon of the 38th Welsh Division Memorial. We'll see a path up ahead, and we'll take that up the slope to round the back of the memorial, and from this high point we've got some incredible views across the valley and towards Mametz Wood itself. The memorial here commemorates the 38th Welsh Division. This was a unit of the British Army formed in 1914, part of Kitchener's army. Lord Kitchener, as Secretary of State for War, had called for 100,000 volunteers, and by the end of 1914 he had over 1 million men who joined this new army. And the battalions of the Welsh Regiment, the South Wales Borderers and the Royal Welsh Fusiliers that formed this division were recruited at that time on a localised basis. So they represented really a huge cross-section of the men from Wales that served in the Great War. At the time, they were often referred to as Lloyd George's army. Lloyd George, a famous Welsh politician, had had a heavy hand in the raising of the division in 1914, and his son was an officer serving within its ranks. Once its training was over, it came to France at the end of 1915 and served in the sector in northern France close to the village of Levanty, a quiet sector where it acclimatised to trench warfare. It then moved down to the Somme. It marched all the way down from northern France to take part in the Battle of the Somme, and its first attack here took place from the ground behind us on the 7th of July 1916. This attack was poorly planned, and the artillery really had not done its job. There was no extensive German trench system in Mametz Wood, although the Germans had dug in various parts of it. They also had platforms up in the trees with machine guns, but much of this had been untouched by the bombardment. The Germans had not been destroyed by the shells that were there to protect the infantry making this attack. So when the battalions of the Welsh Regiment and South Wales Borderers came up over the high point behind us, down into the valley ahead, which became known as Death Valley, towards a promontory of the wood known as the Hammerhead, they came under withering fire from the German defenders of the wood, and those attacks melted away very quickly indeed. A second attack went in on the 10th of July. This time there was a heavier use of artillery. It was said by some of the veterans who were here that incendiary shells were used that set parts of the wood on fire, and battalions of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers got into the southern area of the wood across to our left and fought their way not from trench to trench, but from tree to tree, ride to ride, broken trunk to broken trunk, until on the 14th of July they emerged on the far edge of the wood on the Contal-Maison-Longueval road, and Mametz Wood was finally taken at the cost of over 4,000 casualties, killed, wounded and missing, to the Welsh Division. I was lucky to visit this site before the memorial was here, in the company of Tom Price, a veteran of the South Wales Borderers. The division decided after the war to put a little memorial plaque in Mametz Church. It's one of the least visited memorials on the Somme because the church is hardly ever open, and that was true back in the 1980s as well. When I stood here with Tom, it wasn't his first visit. He'd been back before, and he'd already made his mind up about this. He'd said that it's such a shame there is no memorial to us, to our sacrifice here on this spot, overlooking where so many young Welshmen died in 1916. And a group of members of the Western Front Association from Wales got together, and this memorial was the result. It's a magnificent memorial, a huge bronze red dragon with its claws wrapped around barbed wire, the badges of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and the South Wales Borderers and the Welsh Regiment on the pillar beneath, and it overlooks, just as Tom had wished, that site where the Welshmen had gone into attack in July of 1916 and suffered such terrible casualties. Having spent that time on the ground with veterans like Tom Price, I developed a bit of an interest in Mametz Wood in the Welsh Division, and I found myself tracking down further veterans. And following an article I wrote for a newspaper, a veteran called Albert Chesters from Wrexham got in touch with me, and he proved to be one of the many remarkable Great War veterans that I had the privilege and the honour to interview. Albert was a miner. He'd grown up in Wrexham, and his brother and his father had both died in a pit accident in 1912. When war broke out, he was one of the first to join, and his enlistment in the 17th Battalion of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers was not, in his words, about patriotic belief. It was more that he could get out of the pit, get out of the mines for a while. He figured that if the war would really be over by Christmas, he'd join up, march around in some fresh air, get some decent food, see a bit of other parts of Britain, and then return to his normal job in the coal mine. But it didn't quite work out like that. When Albert joined up, he'd never fired a rifle in his life, and when they put a Lee Enfield in his hands, he found that he was a natural crack shot, and eventually he became one of the battalion's snipers. When he went across to the Western Front with the battalion at the end of 1915, he went into the trenches at Levanti and carried out his sniper activity. He used to tell me that he never shot ordinary soldiers. They were just like him. He always went for the officers. Something he would always say with a wry smile. When I went to see him, we spoke for hours, and not long afterwards a little package arrived from him. He'd gone and bought a little notepad, and in that he wrote his Great War memoirs. And this is his account of the attack on Mametz Wood. On the 7th of July, in the morning, we were ordered to move up to the front line to attack Mametz Wood. I can only speak for our brigade. We were about 500 yards off the wood. The 15th Welsh and 11th South Wales Borderers were extended in the front. Our battalion and 10th South Wales Borderers were in reserve. They had the order to advance across to the wood, and the battle started. We didn't move, we watched the attack. It was terrible to see those lads being mowed down by German machine gunners, on platforms, in the trees. They never got near the wood. They were wiped out. At break of day on the 10th of July, the attack on the wood started again, and this time they got in the wood, and were fighting then within the wood itself. We were still in Carnoy Valley until about 12 o'clock. Then orders came for us to move to the wood again. On our way up, some of the platoon had to call at the ammunition dump in Mametz village and pick up some grenades. I was one of them, so that meant we were left behind and had to follow later. When we did land in the wood, we dumped the bombs and were told our platoon were up in the front and to go and find them. When we got there, we found it was C Company we'd found instead of A Company. Anyway, we stayed to help them attack the Germans. After a while, the Germans started to fall back, and we followed them. After going back some distance, they turned and started firing back. That was when I got a bullet through my left knee, and that was the end for me. I got rid of my tackle and hopped back down the wood. I caught up with the stretcher bearers. They put me on a stretcher, and on a long and rough journey I landed in Mametz village, next into an ambulance, and the next I remember I was lying on a bed being undressed by nurses at number 14 General Hospital in Wimmera. What had happened in this battle with Albert is that he'd been removed from the sniping section and sent back to a rifle platoon. They didn't think that snipers would be needed. And as he went through the shattered woods and they clambered over the wrecks of the trees and the splintered branches, he sensed somehow that a German sniper was taking a bead on them, and indeed they were fired upon. So using his Lee Enfield, he tried to track the sniper, and he was about to shoot, getting a comfortable position in which to fire his weapon, pushed his knee out slightly, not realising that it was exposed round the corner of the tree when the German opened fire and a bullet took off his kneecap. And that's what got him out of Mametz Wood. He crawled, as he mentioned, back to those stretcher bearers, and they took him back to the dressing station, then beyond to the medical facilities behind the lines. He was discharged from the army, unfit for further service, about a year later, and in late 1917 he returned to the coal mines in Wrexham, where he remained until he retired many, many decades later. As I've said several times, an incredible generation, an ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances, incredible things that he lived through. Leaving the memorial, we take the steps to the right and go down into the quarry. And almost directly opposite, there's a little path through the crops and across the field to the edge of Mametz Wood. And we'll follow that. For many years, Mametz Wood was officially closed, and it largely still is. But many people come here now, and the owner understands the need, the necessity, to stand under the canopy, to look amongst the trees, and think back over a century to 1916. So we too will stand here and see the slight indentations of shell holes amongst the undergrowth, hear the birds in the trees above us, and the wind slowly catching the leaves and their gentle movement in the breeze. Nature has recovered Mametz Wood. That cure for lust of blood has long since passed, and Robert Graves' apocalyptic view of the wood that he related in his book Goodbye to All That, of shattered trees, of bodies in those trees, of that sight that not just Graves but many veterans mentioned, of a diminutive Welshman locked in death with a 6-foot Prussian guardsman having bayoneted each other in their final act. Those things have gone from Mametz Wood now, and nature reclaims, just as it should. Leaving the woods, we return across the fields to the track, and we follow it to our left. A little bit further up, we come to a modern water pumping station that the farmers use as part of their work here, and it marks the entrance, to your right, of Caterpillar Valley, the caterpillar-shaped valley that runs from here across to the nearby village of Montauban. Before the Battle of the Somme, this was behind the German lines, and the banks you can see ahead of you where the trees are were lined with timber structures in which soldiers slept, going to and from the trenches. I once found a German schnapps glass in the undergrowth beneath where these wooden structures would have been, and I imagined a German officer toasting the Kaiser and tossing it over the side of the balcony, only to be picked up decades later by me. I came here once with my old friend Yves Foucault, who was the gardener for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who I mentioned in the very first podcast of the Old Front Line. He knew the landowner here, and we had permission to walk the valley, and he took me about halfway up to an area where in the 1920s there'd been a massive ammunition explosion. They'd gathered in all of the shells from the surrounding battlefields and safely placed them here, away from the neighbouring farms and the neighbouring houses, and then detonated them to dispose of them. When we came here, the ground was ploughed, and everywhere there were fragments of shells and bits of fuses of all shapes and sizes and all different types. So we tend to think of the Iron Harvest just being artefacts from the war itself, but here it's from the post-war clear-up period, when they were clearing the battlefields and disposing munitions like this on a widespread basis, not just here on the Somme, but across the old Western Front, just about everywhere. Continuing along the track, we'll pass where the hammerhead jutted out from this side of Mametz Wood, where in that early attack on the 7th of July, the men of the South Wales Borderers and the Welsh Regiment suffered murderous casualties in trying to cross the ground that we're now walking. And ahead of us, we'll see another cemetery. This is Flat Iron Copse Cemetery. We'll reach the gate, open it up, and we'll head on in. There's just over 1,500 burials here, of which about a third are unknown. Quite a large number of them are men from the Welsh Division who died in the fighting for Mametz Wood. But in the field just to the right of the cemetery was a medical post, a dressing station for the rest of the Battle of the Somme, and casualties evacuated from the fighting around High Wood and beyond that towards Warlencourt were brought back here for treatment and died of their wounds, and that's how many of the burials here came to be. There's a lot of fascinating stories in this cemetery. Like all these silent cities of the Great War that act as beacons along the old front line, they're like time capsules. They have so much to tell us, and we could fill probably endless podcasts with the stories they contain. And we'll walk across through the graves to the headstone of Corporal Edward Dwyer of the East Surrey Regiment. Dwyer was a pre-war regular soldier, a young lad from Fulham, who was out in France from the very beginning of the war. He took part in the retreat from Mons, the fighting on the Marne and the Aisne, and in the First Battle of Ypres. And during Second Ypres, in 1915, his unit was defending Hill 60, the vital linchpin in the defence just outside the city. It was here that he was awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery, and he was badly wounded during this action. Back home in Britain, after he'd recovered from his wounds, he was used in various recruiting marches to try and entice young men like him to enlist. And these marches achieved a lot of publicity, and for a working class lad, suddenly he had a lot of fame. His face was in almost every newspaper, and most unusually he was approached to make a voice recording on a wax cylinder. Now, for any working class man to be asked to record their own voice was extraordinary at the time of the First World War, and this made it doubly extraordinary that here he was, a recipient of the Victoria Cross, just back for the front. So a recording was made, and this is a little extract from it that gives you a bit of an insight into what he said. It's faded and it crackles. It's over a century old now, but it's very powerful as we hear his voice.
There was only one thing that could cheer us up on the march, that was singing. We used to sing Tipperary choruses, invented by some of the chaps. Tipperary was in full swing then, and they'd always gone to something they'd invented themselves. It used to buck us up, and we would march all the better for it. Sometimes we'd sing some of T.H. Eliot's songs, you know, the chocolate-coloured tune, but we'd always go into something we'd invented. I don't think I've got much of a voice for singing, but I try and sing one or two of the choruses we used to sing. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We'd be far better off, far better off, far better off in a hug. Here we are, here we are, here we are again. Hello, 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 hello. Here we are, here we are, here we are again. Hello, 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 hello. Woo!
So a unique recording in many ways. Unique because he was a working class boy, and this sort of thing just never happened to young men like him. But more than that, not long after making this recording, he returned to the front, and standing here at his grave, we know that this is where his journey's end was. This is where his war and his life came to a close. So not only is it a rare recording of an ordinary man, it is the only known recording of the voice of a soldier who died in the Great War. And what a thing it is to play that recording, standing here at his grave. Walking past where Dwyer is, we come into part of the cemetery where there are a number of graves of pairs of brothers, the most famous of which are the Tregaskis brothers from the Welsh Regiment, who died in the attack on Mametz Wood. Close in age, they joined up together, they were promoted together, commissioned at the same time, promoted to lieutenants at the same time, went to France together, into the trenches together, into the attack on this wood together, and they died together as well. It's said that one fell first, and the other was cradling him in his arms as he too was killed. Pairs of brothers killed on the same day, I'd like to be able to say, was an unusual occurrence in the Great War, but that's far from the truth. And there are so many brothers buried in cemeteries like these across the Western Front. Before we leave, we'll walk to the back of the cemetery. There are 2 graves here that I always visit, of 2 officers of the Queen's Regiment, the Royal West Surreys. When you visit the cemeteries of the Great War, you find graves that you are always drawn to somehow, and the men they commemorate become your friends. You know their lives, their stories, and you become connected to them, and you find the connections that they have too. And these 2 graves are connected by virtue of their service. These are men who served together in the same regiment, the Queen's, before the Great War. Both were regular soldiers. Major Geoffrey Brooke Parnell was the son of the 3rd Baron Congleton. He was a pre-war regular in the 1st Queen's and had been in France since the very beginning of the war. By the time of the Somme, he was commanding the 1st Battalion as an acting lieutenant colonel, and he was killed in the first assault on High Wood in July of 1916. Buried almost exactly behind him is his old friend, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Percival Hamilton. Hamilton also served with the 1st Queen's, but in 1914 he was sent on attachment to the 19th London Regiment, rising to take command of the battalion. He was killed almost 2 months later in the final attack on High Wood, when his battalion led the assault into what was left of that shattered wood. So here are 2 men connected by their pre-war service in the same battalion, who served in the same corner of the Somme battlefields, one killed in the first attack on High Wood, the other killed in the second, both buried on the battlefield, and their graves concentrated here, and by an extraordinary coincidence they are buried together, comrades in life, comrades in death. I often think that stories like these want and need to be found. I'll put pictures of both Parnell and Hamilton up on the Old Frontline website at www.oldfrontline.co.uk. Leaving the cemetery, we return to the track, and we turn left and continue walking up the valley. The far end of Mametz Wood is across to our left. Flatiron Copse, which the cemetery is named after, is up above us now to our right, and the road winds and continues towards the next village we can see ahead of us, and that village is Bazentin-le-Petit. Further up on the left is a long embankment. It looks like a field boundary, but it is in fact the original track that ran through this valley, Death Valley, and it was the original route to the front line once the Battle of the Somme had moved on. The track we're on now was used, but not quite in the same way. Battalion after battalion marched down that track, and the stragglers of those battalions marched back after the attack on the next wood, High Wood, a place even more fearsome than Mametz Wood had been in July 1916. And that's a subject for another podcast. We'll walk this ground again and follow from here through Bazentin and beyond to High Wood on another day along the old front line. It's that part of the podcast where we look at an object connected to the Great War. And once again this week, it's a photograph. This is a photograph mounted on card. I bought a collection of these in an old junk shop in Littlehampton that I used to go to when I lived in Sussex many years ago. They were piled up at the back in the coldest, dampest part of the shop, and I pulled them out from underneath something, and here were these incredible photographs taken by an officer of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers of the battlefields of the Great War where the Welsh Division had fought in its first 2 years. This one is a view towards Mametz Wood, and I'll turn it over, and on the back it says Mametz Wood before the attack. So it appears this officer climbed a tree with his camera, looked towards the wood that they were about to attack when it was in full leaf, and photographed it from the distance. A pretty unique image in many ways. And I'll put this up on the website so you can see it with some shots of some of the other photographs. I sadly know very little about the photographer. His name was D.J. Davies. He was a photographer in Lampeter, and he produced cards, and that's about all I found out about him. Images taken with pocket cameras are not unusual, but this appears to have been a proper camera, what we call a full-frame camera now probably, and he managed to take that with him to war and take some photographs, and I suspect that these are not the only ones that he took, that I've only got a tiny percentage of the photographs that he managed to take along the Western Front. Unique insights into the war. Photographs connect us to the conflict in a very important way. Through them we can visualise the ground as it was and connect that visualisation with what we know of the ground today. You build up this mind map of the Western Front, and you quickly discover through photographs like this that it wasn't all mud and blood and shell holes and shattered ground. So that's where we leave the Old Front Line for this week. I'll see you again soon. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or other podcast services. Tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. Follow me on Twitter at Somcorps, and have a look at the podcast website www.oldfrontline.co.uk. I'll see you next week on the battlefields of the Great War.